Well, let me ask you this, because I saw you got a little bit flustered when 50 Cent surprised you. Does 50
I
Cent
can't
make
even
you
look
nervous?
at 50 Cent. I can't even.
You can't look at 50 Cent.
The air in the upstate New York cabin does not carry the scent of roasting garlic or the familiar, comforting hum of a bustling kitchen. Instead, it is thick with the suffocating weight of a silence that has been years in the making. Rachael Ray, the woman whose raspy laughter once served as the upbeat soundtrack to a million American afternoons, sits in the amber glow of a fading fire, her eyes tracing the hollow spaces where a partnership used to breathe. For decades, the world watched a curated dance of domestic bliss, yet behind the vibrant sets and the GVOO catchphrases, a darker, more jagged reality was carving itself into the marrow of her marriage to John Cusimano. What happens when the person who taught a nation how to nurture others finds herself starving in the isolation of her own home? As the embers pop and hiss, a devastating question hangs in the frigid air: can a bond forged in the heat of public adoration survive the cold, private realization that you have become strangers sharing a single, haunted bed? The Adirondack wilderness does not offer comfort, it offers a vast, indifferent cathedral of pine and granite, where the wind howls with the ancestral ghosts of those who broke their backs against the frost-heaved earth. Here, amidst the sprawling, lonely quiet, the soil is as unforgiving as the secrets buried beneath the floorboards of a life built on relentless momentum. For Rachael, this landscape was the mirror of her own soul, a terrain defined by the hustle, a frantic, rhythmic pace she adopted not out of greed, but as a desperate sprint to outrun the echoes of a fractured lineage and the suffocating fear of remaining insignificant. She learned early that to be still was to be forgotten, and so she transformed her existence into a masterclass of kinetic energy, her hands never empty, her voice never silent, her mind always 3 moves ahead of the hunger that chased her from childhood. When John entered this orbit, he was not merely a lover, he was a theological necessity. To Rachael, he represented the anchor, the heavy, grounding iron that would finally stop her from drifting into the dark, screaming abyss of her own unchecked ambition. In those early years, their connection was a fever dream of shared playlists and the intimate, clove-scented smoke of late-night whispers that drifted through the bars of Manhattan and the quiet corners of their hearts. They built a fortress of mutual understanding, a sanctuary constructed of vinyl records and private jokes that seemed, to any outside observer, to be utterly impenetrable. But even within the golden haze of those first summers, a subtle, creeping frost was beginning to crystallize on the inner walls of their home. The psychological weight of being the provider is a quiet, heavy crown, and Rachael wore it until it began to leave indentations in her very identity. She poured her essence into the world's plate, feeding a global audience of millions who looked to her for warmth and nourishment, while she remained unknowingly blind to the fact that she was depleting the vital reserves intended for her own hearth. As the empire grew, the power dynamic shifted with the glacial, terrifying inevitability of a tectonic plate. Rachael's light became a supernova, brilliant and all-encompassing, yet it possessed a cold, unintended consequence: it cast John into a permanent, cooling shadow. The silence between them began to change its texture, evolving from a comfortable companion into a dense, atmospheric pressure. A silent resentment began to germinate in the damp corners of their marriage, a bitter weed growing toward a sun it could never quite reach. Rachael believed she was building a future, but she was actually constructing an elaborate stage where there was only room for one performer. They moved through the halls of their life like 2 ghosts navigating a labyrinth of their own design, passing one another in the kitchen without the spark of recognition. The fire that would eventually claim their physical world was still years away, but as the sun dipped below the jagged Adirondack horizon, the internal smoldering had already begun, a slow, oxygen-starved burn that threatened to consume the very foundation they claimed to be protecting. One night, standing in the kitchen as the house groaned under the weight of the mountain winter, Rachael realized she couldn't remember the last time she had truly looked at John without seeing a task to be managed. The transformation of a home into a monument is a slow, agonizing process that leaves no room for the messy, unpolished reality of human connection. As Rachael's empire expanded into a multi-billion-dollar behemoth, the domestic sanctuary she had fought so hard to build began to undergo a chilling metamorphosis, shifting from a place of refuge into a high-stakes boardroom where the fluorescent lights of commerce never truly dimmed. The kitchen, once a theater of spontaneous joy and the clinking of glasses, was now a laboratory of metrics. Every meal was dissected for its marketability, every personal anecdote was weighed for its resonance with a demographic, and even the sacred quiet of their vacations became nothing more than a scenic backdrop for a global brand. The woman John had married was being systematically replaced by an institution, a curated version of herself that belonged more to the public than to the man standing in the corner of the room, watching the woman he loved disappear behind a curtain of professional requirements. John, a man of intellect and artistic temperament, found himself navigating the treacherous, murky waters of a new identity, Mr. Ray. It was a title that carried the sharp, persistent sting of emasculation, a hollow label that seemed to erase his own history as a musician and a lawyer. He became a supporting character in the epic of her life, tasked with the heavy, invisible burden of sustaining a woman who was increasingly becoming a monument of industry. We witnessed the agonizing psychological pressure of their public perfection, the exhausting mandate to perform an effortless happiness whenever the cameras were rolling. They became masters of the curated smile, the well-timed touch, and the synchronized laugh, while behind the closed doors of their dressing rooms, the air was static with the weight of things unsaid. Private conversations, once fluid and vulnerable, turned into cold, transactional exchanges regarding schedules, logistics, and the preservation of the image. The intimacy that once flowed between them like a rich, vintage wine was now a rationed resource, distributed in small, unsatisfying drops. Rachel felt the fracture deepening within her own chest. She was haunted by a growing realization that the more she gave to her fans, the more of her spirit she broadcasted into a million living rooms, the less of Rachel remained for John to hold on to in the dark. She was being hollowed out by her own success, becoming a vessel for the needs of others while her own marriage starved in the light of her fame. They were moving at vastly different velocities, two celestial bodies trapped in an orbit that was slowly, inevitably decaying, drifting toward a collision that neither felt empowered to stop. The gravity of her career was pulling them apart even as it kept them locked in a public embrace. Just as they reached the pinnacle of their joint influence, standing together atop a mountain of achievements and accolades, a sudden, sharp fracture in their communication suggested that the foundation beneath them was far worse than cracked, it was entirely hollow. During a rare moment of forced stillness, a question was asked that neither dared to answer, and the silence that followed was not one of peace, but of a terrifying, terminal void. The public saw a power couple at the height of their reign, but in the echoing chambers of their private life, the music had already begun to fade. They were standing on the edge of a precipice, looking out over a kingdom they had built together, only to realize they were both profoundly, devastatingly alone. One evening, as the production lights finally flickered off and the crew retreated into the night, Rachel reached for John's hand in the shadows, only to find he had already stepped away, leaving her grasping at nothing but the cold, lingering scent of expensive stage makeup. The year 2020 arrived not with a whisper, but with a roar of consuming flame that tore through the timber of their Adirondack sanctuary, a visceral tragedy that served as both a literal and metaphorical cleansing of a life built on gilded veneers. In a single, harrowing evening, decades of curated memories, the shared playlists, the handwritten recipes, the physical manifestations of a 20-year union, were reduced to gray, drifting ash. As the sirens wailed against the indifferent mountain silence, Rachel and John stood on the frozen grass, the heat of their dissolving world reflecting in eyes that had forgotten how to truly see one another. In the brutal aftermath of the fire, the couple was forced into a raw, unfiltered proximity that the frantic pace of their careers had allowed them to evade for nearly a decade. There were no cameras to perform for, no scripts to follow, and no kitchen islands to stand behind as a barrier. There was only the jagged, exposed debris of a relationship that had been smoldering in secret long before the first spark touched the roof. Without the constant, numbing distraction of the show, the psychological architecture of their marriage began to crumble under the weight of the silence. John's response to the trauma was a profound, chilling withdrawal, a retreat into a private fortress of grief and introspection that Rachel could not breach. Conversely, Rachel's internal engine kicked into a frantic, desperate overdrive. She attempted to fix the unfixable, channeling her pain into blueprints and contractor meetings, trying to outbuild the emptiness in her chest. These two conflicting coping mechanisms collided in a series of devastating, quiet confrontations in the cramped quarters of their temporary life. While the world watched a resilient woman rebuilding a famous kitchen on social media, the spirits within the temporary walls were grappling with a much deeper, more permanent ruin. This was the agonizing season of the survival guilt, a period where the terrifying realization dawned that once the material clutter of a multi-million-dollar life is stripped away, you might not actually like the person standing across from you in the wreckage. The cruel whispers of the tabloids and the sensationalist screams of impending divorce were mere background noise compared to the deafening, internal sound of two people realizing they had lost the ability to speak the same emotional language. Every shared glance became a search for a person who no longer existed. They were survivors of a catastrophe, yet they were drowning in the sudden, terrifying clarity of their own disconnection. As the last of the acrid smoke finally cleared from the mountain air, leaving only the blackened skeleton of their former life, Rachael turned to look at the man she had loved for 20 years. In the cold, unforgiving light of a new morning, she realized with a jolt of pure, icy terror that she was no longer looking at her anchor, she was staring directly into the hollow, haunted eyes of a ghost. The final movement of this shared life does not begin with a grand reconstruction, but with the quiet, devastating choice to finally stop running. As the world waited for the resurrection of the brand, Rachael Ray made a much more difficult decision. She chose to stand still within the smoke. What really happened that the tabloids hungered for was never a single, explosive scandal or a dramatic betrayal. Instead, it was the slow, agonizing work of dismantling a dysfunctional legacy. It was the realization that the empire they had built was a cathedral with no altar, a house of cards that had to fall so that something authentic could finally breathe. They retreated from the sprawling ruin of their main estate and moved into the guest house, a smaller, tighter, and infinitely more honest space. Here, there were no corridors long enough to avoid a confrontation, and no spare rooms in which to hide from the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of their shared history. It was a pressure cooker of proximity that forced a final, visceral reckoning. In this confined sanctuary, the narration explores a haunting beauty found only in the broken. The decision to stay was not born of habit, nor was it a surrender to the public's expectation of a happy ending. It was a conscious, painful choice made in the recognition of their mutual wounds. Rachael, the woman who had spent decades convinced that her worth was measured in 30-minute increments and the satisfaction of a global audience, began to undergo a profound psychological shift. She started to learn that her true value was not tied to the 30-minute meal or the manic energy of a television set, but to the heavy, unscripted hours of silence she could now endure while sitting across from John. The frantic need to perform, to nourish, and to fix began to evaporate, replaced by a quiet, steady acceptance of the man who had survived the fire by her side. The transition was not easy, it was a poetic, painful rebirth that required them to shed their former skins like scorched parchment. They reached a plateau of radical honesty where the pretenses of Mr. and Mrs. Ray were discarded in favor of two scarred individuals trying to remember why they had chosen each other in the first place. The legacy they were now building had nothing to do with recipes or branding, it was found in the endurance of a love that had been tested by literal and metaphorical fire and managed to survive within the ashes. They found a strange, tragic inspiration in the charred earth of their estate, a reminder that while everything material can be stolen by a spark, the internal architecture of a soul is much harder to incinerate. However, as the narration draws to a close, we see them sitting together in the soft, amber glow of a new morning, the Adirondack peaks rising like jagged teeth against a pale sky. They are not the same people who started this journey 20 years ago. Their voices are lower, their movements more deliberate, and the scars on their hearts now perfectly match the scorched landscape of their home. There is a sense of peace, yes, but it is a peace earned through immense loss. The script leaves the audience in a state of reflective melancholy, contemplating the true nature of their survival. They have reclaimed their bond, but the ghosts of the perfect couple they once were still linger in the mountain mist, never to return. As the camera pulls back, leaving them as two small figures against the vast, indifferent wilderness, a final, haunting question hangs in the air like the scent of wood smoke on a winter breeze. As they sit together in this fragile, new light, sharing a quiet that no longer feels like a threat, one cannot help but wonder, is this a true beginning, the start of a chapter written in the ink of honesty? Or is this merely a long, beautiful, and profoundly tragic goodbye to the people they used to be?